Thank you everyone for coming out here to JNUC 2018. And so Ben and I are going to be talking about the journey that Salesforce has been working on with deploying their own Jamf Pro instance on top of AWS. So who are we? This is Ben Marks. He is a client engineer at Salesforce. So he's been working inside the Mac space for quite a few years. He's been overseeing growth from 3,500 Macs to 35,000 Macs over 5 years at Salesforce with their programs there. I'm Nick Tembrink. I'm the DevOps manager at Jamf. I do all sorts of things. Some of them are cloud related. Some of them are internal services related. Some of them are build and release related. So actually building our products itself that go out to all of you. So there we go. So what we're going to be giving here today is a pretty high-level abstraction for you of what is AWS or Amazon Web Services. So Amazon Web Services is a cloud platform that you can utilize in many different ways. You hear a lot of new technologies and a lot of new jargon around AWS, around like containerless, containerized, elastic, all sorts of things. But today what we're going to be mostly talking about is some base level technologies inside of AWS that many of you would have a much more comfortable experience with and much more applicable to your day-to-day lives. So there we go. So today we're just going to use a little bit of terminology just to set a base level here. I'm sure many of you can handle much more complex abstractions and language, but we just want to set a common language here for some of the things we're going to be talking about. So today, just for instance, when we say instance, we are referring to something as like a virtual machine or a server. So some of you are still running on bare metal. Some of you are working inside of virtualized environments. And some of you actually could be running your Jamf Pro inside of a container environment as well, if you are that bold. Security group. This is part of the IAM policies inside of AWS. And these can also be similar constraints of like firewalls, ports opening and closing, things of that nature. Elasticache. That itself is a caching server, or for like things like Memcached D as well. That's going to help your performance there. And then today we're going to say VPC. Stands for Virtual Private Cloud, but in reality that is your own private network inside of AWS. You might actually have at your company, if you're utilizing something like AWS or Azure or GCP, whatever flavor it is, you might have multiple accounts, multiple networks inside of there. You might have one product group separate from another product group. You might have your own VPCs. You might share one. So before we get into some of this basic stuff, I just want to make an aside note to this as well, is that there's reasons that some people decide to utilize a technology like AWS or Azure or GCP, et cetera, which is sometimes they feel they don't have the personal bandwidth or the capabilities in-house to host a data center that can be performed at 24/7, 365. So a lot of people view this as, yeah, this might be an opportunity that we need to take to get a little bit more stability for our base level environments. Which is completely valid. There's some school systems, as you may know, that their Jamf Pro administrator is the librarian. Kudos for them to putting on that technology hat and really running with it, but we don't want to necessarily put that burden onto someone that's, IT is a task and not their job, to also have to run a server stack. So if their school environment or whatever business they're in feels that this is a better approach, this is a valid approach for running and operating your Jamf Pro instance on top of a cloud environment. Sorry, I need to breathe more there. So what we're going to talk about now is just some base services that you need to be running to make sure that you can run Jamf Pro. So here we're going to say, let's talk about EC2. So EC2 does stand for an Elastic Cloud Compute Service. This is a class of services on top of AWS. And that class of services is really essentially an instance. It's a server. It's a server inside of a data center that you can choose to use. You can choose, if any of you have been inside of AWS console before, you have a myriad of different different sizing options, speeds, constraints of focusing on memory versus CPU speed versus high data I/O. So depending on your applications, you can select all sorts of different EC2s day in, day out. RDS is Relational Database Service. So really, this is an instance that's built up for optimized for databases. So just like on site, you need to run a database for Jamf Pro. There you go. That's also another topic there in itself. But yeah, RDS is a very common technology on top of the AWS platform. And then we have ELB here. That's an elastic load balancer. This is your load balancing for your traffic going into your Jamf Pro server, just like you may have on site. All right, so just going to move on here. A couple more services that we're going to need to talk about. So Elasticache here, this is a caching server instance. That is a product type from AWS itself. So when you actually see Elasticache on here, you'll actually see that in there. It's not an analogy for something else. Excuse me here one moment. So the next one we have on here on the list too is S3 Simple Storage Solution. This is a service and an architecture that you can have many different uses for. So for instance, if you needed to have a hosting distribution point, this is what you can use for that. You can use it for many other things too, but in this case for our examples today, this is what we'll use for that distribution point. And then CloudFront's our next piece. Showing there? Okay, yeah. CloudFront's the next piece here. Now, CloudFront, when used with S3, that's going to mirror storage globally. So that's actually going to bring those things that you need to distribute to your customer, or your internal customer, I should say. That's actually going to bring them out closer to them, to a CDN, to an endpoint closer to the customer outside of your actual Jamf Pro instance. So if your server is based in London or in Frankfurt or Tokyo or wherever it is, and you have customers on the other side of the world, you need to get content to them quickly. You're going to put it on top of that framework, and so it'll be served out, easily available, and low latency for them. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to be handing it over to Ben here, and he's going to walk us through some basic pieces around setting up some EC2 instances. All right, it's all yours, Ben.
We switched the...
There we go.
Okay, so my goal when I came up with this idea was to really try and walk you through the basics of setting up all of these services. But before I do that, I wanted to show this screen, and the reason that we created a subset, these are all of the other features of AWS. You don't need to know all of these. We're just going to focus on the ones that you need for your Jamf Pro server. So I'm going to start with EC2, and I'm going to time myself here. I'm hoping to get through all of these, but in the name of depth, I may not. So I'm going to try and really stick to the time here. So EC2, that's what you would run Apache Tomcat on. This is assuming a split server where your database is on one instance and your Tomcat is another. In theory, you could run both on a single EC2 instance if you wanted to. But what I'm going to show here is a split server where we have some Tomcat servers and then we have a separate database server. And I'm just going to walk through the steps as if we were setting it up for real. This first one is selecting your OS image. There are a lot of built-in ones. Amazon has their own flavor of Linux. There's some other Windows ones here as well. You can also upload your own image if you have your own image. I'm just going to select the basic Amazon one here. There are also some free things that you'll see. In theory, you should be able to set this up on your own. for free and test it out using some of the different free options.
By the way, this is a live demo today, so if things go haywire,
You ratted
bear
me
with
out.
us.
You ratted me out.
No, it's showing you off.
So this next one is picking the type of EC2 instance. These are basically the resources that are dedicated to that instance. vCPUs, the type of CPU, RAM, networking. And then they're not just the resources, they're optimized for certain things as well. So there's general purpose, there's compute optimized, there's GPU optimized, there's memory optimized. I'm going to stick with the general purpose one here. I think I asked you. You select general purpose? Or you didn't know?
No.
Okay. I selected compute optimized based on their descriptions. One thing about the Amazon website is there is a ton of information here via rollovers, via tutorials. So all of these here, there's a separate page I'm not going to go to, but it'll show, exactly what resources are allocated to them, what the difference is between general purpose and compute optimized. But I'm just going to pick the free one here. And then, so this next one, there's a lot going on here. For our purposes, I'm going to set up 2 instances because I know that I'm going to be behind a load balancer. I'm not going to pick spot instance. Now, some of these things here are things you would set up in advance. And they're networking types of things that I'm not going to really go into in depth here. One would be the VPC, that virtual networking stuff. And then a subset of that is the subnet. So that would all be sort of infrastructure stuff that you would set up in advance. The auto-assigned public IP, that's also that way. Now, if it's behind a load balancer, you probably aren't going to need a public IP. If this is going to be your server that's facing the internet, you probably would. But in these cases, I'm just going to let my VPC settings handle that. I'm just going to leave the rest of these default. IAM role, we're going to cover IAM in a little while. That's sort of the user management that's built into Amazon. You can control access to these services based on that, or you can do it in a different way. If you have your servers linked to LDAP or something like that, you can do that as well. The rest of these, I'm just going to leave it as default as well. You probably don't want to change shutdown behavior or termination protection. And these rollovers are great as well. And I'm going to speed this up a little bit. So and the next one is storage. Oops, let me pick 1 second here. I practiced this. All right, there we go. Okay. This next one is the type of storage. For these purposes, general purpose is fine. There are other options as well, but for these purposes, general purpose is fine. Tags is pretty straightforward, just how you can sort through these later on.
Tags are super useful too, that if you're spinning up multiple instances and you maybe need to tag a department or a specific use case, super useful.
Or a project.
Yep.
If you have a bunch of teams migrating to this all at once.
Yep.
Okay. Next one is security group. Now these are, like we said before, these are just basically firewall rules. I'm just going to leave this at default. That's the last one for EC2. I'm not. So if I clicked review and launch, that would then launch 2 EC2 instances, and I'd be ready to go. So then, now I could, you can, if you really wanted to, create a third one if you wanted to put your database in an EC2 instance. But the next service I'm going to show is RDS. And RDS is basically an instance optimized for a database. And so that has a little bit of a different setup. And it's a little bit easier to set up. And all of the questions that it's going to ask are primarily around the idea of databases.
And some of that, like specificity around setup for a database would be different storage types attached to those servers. In some cases, some are SSD, others are spinning disk. So depending on your use cases, you may need higher or lower I/O on there too.
Okay. So for our purposes, I think I asked Jamf. Aurora is like a MySQL compatible service. Jamf doesn't officially support it, so I'm not going to show that here. I'm just going to pick MySQL and then click. Now, if you wanted to do the free stuff, if you click down here at the checkbox, it'll show you just the free tiers that you can that you can select. And then if you know this is going to be a test environment, you can select test. I'm going to pick production here. A lot of these, all they're really changing is cost more than anything else. And this is the main setup page for RDS. So I don't think there's anything there. Yeah, just general public license. I don't think Jamf is in MySQL 8, right? Still 5.7?
Not at, so yeah, we are built on top of 8 and yeah, optimized for running on 8.
Oh, it is 8 now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, well, then I'll leave this at 8. This pull-down menu, again, like that long page we saw for EC2 instances, this is selecting your resources. Now, these are, just like you had general, compute, RAM, these are optimized for databases, just in a pull-down menu format. Multi-zone deployment, this is basically, this is a simplistic description, but it's basically a hot spare. If your database goes down and you have this feature selected, I tested this live. There's about a 2-minute pause if you're in the web console. You don't need to restart Tomcat. The only side effect is it logs you out of your current session. But if you re-log in, it's as if nothing ever happened. So that can be a really powerful feature. Storage type, general purpose as well. You know, you can pick the size based on what you need. This cost calculator is pretty handy. Not all of the Amazon web pages have this. They're slowly updating the interface. RDS was the first one, I believe, where they have this new interface. I'm assuming maybe they'll have this cost calculator for other services. But right now it seems to be just the database. I'm going to enter some dummy info here just so I can get past this screen. This is basically just, server name. Just 1 second here. And your root user, obviously.
Is it root and password?
It is not.
1, 2, 3, 4?
Shoot.
Same as my luggage.
Oh, what? Oh, 8 characters. Sorry. Okay. Now again, just like with all these other services, you need to pick your VPC and your subnet group. That's the type of foundational stuff you would have set, in advance. Publicly accessible, no, for your database. Probably. I don't know why you would, but
Nothing ever bad could happen with that.
not at all. VPC security groups, same thing, one of those foundational things you'd select. I'm just going to pick a default one so I can proceed. Let's pick any of them here. And then, database name, you can, create your database in advance if you want to. I'm just going to default that. Port, leave the port the same. Parameter groups, leave those the same. You can enable encryption if you want. I'm going to disable that for now. And then elsewhere in this console, you can create your key pair that you would use for that. Backup, it automates backups for you. You can select your window, things like that. Monitoring, you can enable or disable monitoring. Log exports, same thing. You can export those to another service if you want. Your maintenance window, it'll perform maintenance for you if you want. And then this last one, enable delete protection, which is pretty self-explanatory. So how am I doing on time? Okay, so far so good. So that's RDS. That's your database. So the next one is load balancer. Now this is, you don't necessarily have to use a load balancer, but in this case I created 2 EC2 instances, and they're going to be, available. So I want to have something in front of them to manage that traffic. So let's see, that is under EC2 and then load balancers. This search field is great as well. If you can't remember something, just it's probably going to guess right for you if you can't remember exactly where something is. So create load balancer. So for our purposes, we want to create an application load balancer. Let's just name this so I can proceed. This is going to be internet facing, I assume. I guess some of you may have an internal only JSS or Jamf Pro server. I'll leave IPv4 as the default. I'm going to change this because I use SSL, so 8443. If you haven't set this up before, what the normal way to do it would be that your load balancer is SSL, and SSL terminates at the load balancer, and then it feeds the traffic to the Tomcat servers over 8080. So you don't do SSL all the way through. You can do SSL all the way through, but normally you wouldn't really need to do that. VPC again, I'm just going to pick one so I can proceed. I have to pick these subnets for this. But again, this is all that foundational networking stuff you would have set up in advance. Don't copy these things, please. Okay, is that everything? Okay. Security settings. So in this case, since I've selected SSL, it's going to ask me for a certificate. Amazon, you can get certificates from Amazon if you want, or if you already have a certificate, from a from a registrar, you can upload that. In this case, I have one already uploaded, so I'm just going to select that here. These policies here, these are defaults, and they're basically what levels of TLS and those types of things that this is going to support. You want to pick the one that's appropriate for your security settings. I'm going to pick one here, but I'm just going to pick the top one. And then there's another page that describes what the differences are between those. Next page. So security group, again, firewall settings. I'm just going to leave this as a single port. Jamf has a great page that walks you through all the ports that you need to open inbound and outbound. So I'm not going to go through that. But if you need to know that information, Jamf has a great page for it. Routing. Now I don't have this. Actually, that's the next page. This is where if I had 2 available Tomcat servers, this is where I would start selecting them. Let me just pick some dummy information. So, like I was saying before, this is the port from the load balancer to your EC2 instances. So in my case, since I'm terminating SSL at the load balancer, I'm going to go over 8080 to my Tomcats. Instance is fine here. If you had assigned static IPs to them, you could use that as well. Health check is just this. This is that page if you've ever gone to it. If it's a healthy JSS, it just shows 2 brackets on a white page and nothing else. But you can use that page for your monitoring tools to make sure that it's a healthy connection. I don't think I've changed any of these advanced settings, so I'm just going to skip that part. Targets, this is what I was talking about as far as selecting what my servers are. If I had set up the 2 Tomcat instances, they would be in this list. I'm just going to pick these dummy ones for now, and then review. So if I hit create, then there's the load balancer part. So now we have a load balancer. We have 2 EC2 instances running Apache Tomcat, and we have our RDS instance running MySQL. So the next service, which is still an optional service at the moment, but I would recommend probably just biting the bullet and setting it up, is Memcache D. It's still optional at 10.8, right? They didn't change today.
I can't verify that or deny it.
Could have changed today. I think it's still optional. This service is super easy to set up. Basically, you hit create, you click Memcache D, you name it, you pick how many nodes you want, probably 2. You can pick the resources, RAM and stuff. Port 1.2.1 is the default, so you leave that there. I don't think I changed any of these. Yeah, I'm just going to skip those as well. Hit create. There are your Memcache D instances. Now, to set that up, if you haven't done it before, you would go into your Tomcat instances. There's a path to a file in the root.war, and you would manually enter in the URLs of the IPs, which it gives to you if I had actually created these. There's a great Jamf doc for this as well for how to set it up. So Memcache D is super easy to set up. May as well set it up now because it's going to be mandatory at some point. They keep saying. So now we need a bucket to distribute files. That is the S3 option. Now, I'm not going to show S3 because for these purposes, we don't really interact with the S3 page. The Jamf Pro server actually creates your bucket for you. If you haven't set this up before, be aware, if you ever make any changes to that, it recreates your bucket. And again, and again. So you want to get it right the first time when you are setting it up in your JSS. So for the Jamf Pro server, what you need is a user and permissions for that user. And I hinted at this before. That's what you would do here in the identity and access management section. Here we would create a user, give that user permissions, and actually create a group, add that user to a group, and the group would have the permissions. There's some default. Oh wait, let me create new group here. Oh wait, let me go back one. I messed up here. IAM, create individual, manage users, add user. So this is where I would name my user. So user, programmatic access. This user is going to have access to the console. And then next, permissions. So because these, I don't know what these groups are, so I'm going to create a group. And this is what thought I was before. If I type S3 here, there are some default groups with access for S3. Now you want to double check these. It's very easy to accidentally open up your bucket to the world and let anybody read write to it. So you want to make sure you pick the right one here, or you could create a manual one as well if you want. But a lot of times the defaults here are sufficient. So if I hit group, that would create the group. It would add that user to that group. And then in your Jamf Pro server, you would then take that information and enter it into your cloud distribution point. And from there, it creates your cloud distribution point. I'm going to cancel this and go to the final service here that I was going to talk about, which is CloudFront. So CloudFront is basically a CDN, or content delivery network. This works in conjunction with a lot of services, but for our purposes, we're going to use it with S3. When you set this up, you need to have a key in advance, because if you activate the CloudFront feature in your Jamf Pro server, it requires a key as well. but I'm not going to show that here. Now, I'll be honest, the CloudFront service I did not set up. So I'm not exactly sure what all of these settings are, just to be clear. I do know we need the web one, and there are a lot of different options here. Again, this is one that I didn't set up. So, but again, these rollovers are great, and this is an optional feature too. If you're, you don't need to configure S3 with this feature, but if you do, what happens is your cloud distribution point gets mirrored. I've heard between 48 and 80 global points of presence, Amazon data centers. So if you're a global company, that'll speed up, those downloads in all those global regions. Don't quote me on that exact number. But let's see, are there any of these that I do know? Yeah, unfortunately, this is the one I'm sort of weak on. So I know you don't need some of these streaming options. The certificate you don't really need. One thing I learned, so if you've ever tried to download something like in the terminal, once you have a cloud distribution point, it gives you a cloudfront.net URL, and I mistakenly thought that this SSL certificate option would allow you to customize that URL, and that is not what this does. Just to let you know. HTTP versions has some security settings. Logging, you can turn logging on and off where those logs would be. The rest of this is pretty self-explanatory, actually. But I'm going to cancel this, and I think that's it. That's basically covers all the Amazon services. So if you did all of those, you would have a fully functional JSS on the public internet behind a load balancer with 2 EC2 instances, a database with redundancy, your caching server set up, and a cloud distribution point that, if you use CloudFront, would be mirrored globally. So yeah, that covers what I wanted to show you all.
Flip back there. There we go. So, sorry about that. As with anything, if you're familiar from going from a localized data center to a co-location center or another cloud provider, things like that, you will have some caveats there, of course. Connectivity back to your data center local networks, LDAP, syncing with legacy imaging services, and DNS issues. So be mindful of those things. And then a couple last miscellaneous things here. Amazon does have SSL certs, so that is great. They do have a DNS service. Also, there is some pricing differences there. If you're not familiar with Amazon and their pricing, they have on-demand, reserved, and spot. So if you have an Amazon representative and you're thinking about moving your instance to there, please get in contact with them because they can dramatically change your costs utilizing those types of things. And with that, we are on to the question round.
At what point do you see the advantage of moving to hosting your own sort of on-premise but in the cloud JSS versus just going to the JCS and the Jamf cloud option?
So the Jamf cloud option, how do I answer this? To a certain extent, this is more of a financial question than it is a technical question. If you're on premise and you move to the Jamf cloud product, the licensing structure is entirely different. And if you had in perpetual licenses, you're going to lose all that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's more of a financial. Now you do set it up differently as well. There are a few technical differences, but
yeah, and for full disclosure, I'm on the Jamf Cloud side of the business, so I am biased. But yeah, I mean, we do we utilize a lot of similar technologies we've talked about here today, but the way that we implement it for the Jamf Cloud product and orchestrate it is different, and that's some of our own secret in-house sauce kind of thing. But yeah, Ben is pretty much spot on. It's a financial decision mostly, and you don't have a high functional difference between the two. So if your company is deciding to focus energy on administrating of the tech stack, then yeah, if you want to focus on that and spend money on that, then yeah, rolling your own instance on top of AWS is perfectly fine, smart thing to do. Versus racking and stacking in a data center, there's a lot of costs around that as well. Or if your organization is focusing more on end user interactions and things of that nature, and let's not worry about the infrastructure stack behind it, then things like Jamf Cloud is that right option for that.
Rich, you could go next. Okay.
So I wanted to ask about managing instances once they're up in AWS. What tools are you guys using for making sure that your Tomcat hosting instances and also MySQL hosting instances, if you're also putting those in EC2, how are you making sure that those are patched and updated and managed and everything else?
That's a good question. My go live date for this was yesterday while I was in an airport lounge. So we're still working on some of the monitoring stuff. We use some tools, right now we use some tools outside of Amazon, like Zabbix. My service, so we're in the process of moving basically all of our services that are located in San Francisco to Amazon Web Services. My service was the first. We're gonna explore, some of the Amazon tools that are built in, the CloudWatch tools and things like that. We haven't really set that up yet, but there are a lot of great monitoring tools that are built in to Amazon, and you can feed that data, you can feed those logs out to anything else that you want as well, like Zabbix for us. I don't think that's really a great answer, but I think that's the best that I can give you at the moment.
Okay.
Does that help, or?
I was just mostly curious more than anything else if you're using outside tools like something like Puppet or Chef to manage it, or if you were using AWS's own built-in systems manager tools. For my own setup, I'm using Systems Manager and I'm liking it. It's handling a lot for me, including sending logs out to CloudWatch so that I can get that monitoring and get those logs shipped out of my instances so that I can examine them without having to SSH in. Because at this point, I'm at the philosophy of if I have to SSH into an EC2 instance, my automation has failed me somewhere along the way.
Yeah, so we do use Puppet because we upload our own image, and that was basically the exact same image that we were using in our San Francisco data center. So that's still managed by Puppet as well. I would love to get to that point where we don't have to SSH either. Right now, I still probably have to do it if Tomcat goes down. But again, this is my phase 2 stuff that I'm working on as soon as I leave Jamf Nation, because we just went live yesterday.
And you're using a lot of CloudFormation templates as well for spinning up multiple environments consistently as well too.
True, yes. We have a team of people that set up a lot of this, and it may have been a bit overkill, but because we were the first project, they wanted to really hammer down all those types of automation tools. So they built it all out in code so they can click a button, and took our dev environment and just immediately cloned it into our production environment. And also, if for some reason we do need to build another EC2 instance, they can just click a button and it'll instantly do that as well.
Infrastructure as code is a beautiful thing. Write it once, deploy there, write it up, deploy a second place and a third. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, going back on the cost question with AWS, what kind of costs are you looking at monthly for running a Jamf server in AWS, roughly? I mean, based on your size too, I guess. If you can get that.
Yeah, I don't know if I can.
You have
I'm
to wait
gonna-
till next month.
I'm,
Right, yeah.
I'm going to err on the side of not saying that publicly just to be
Okay.
safe.
No, that's totally fine.
And one of the things that we had mentioned earlier too, when I mentioned things like reserved instance costs, like if your business plans to run your Jamf Pro instance out there for extended periods of time, talk to your AWS rep and they can help work out pricing differentials. It could be pretty significant if you are looking to go that direction.
Do you get any further controls over web and API access controlling your own AWS? Can you enforce two-factor or anything like that?
I don't think there's any difference. I mean, it's basically exactly the same as if you were hosting it on site.
I mean, yeah, there's no functional difference for Ben, hosting inside of AWS versus on site versus he can walk over and touch the server physically.
Right, but like GCP now has a Titan key for access for GCP stuff. I didn't know if there was anything similar for AWS access to things like that.
Oh, to actually manipulate your EC2 instance and things like that? Yes, most certainly. Yeah, we utilize that type of technology ourselves every day.
Okay.
Even if someone logs in as root, you can have that auto flagged and alerted and sent off to a separate account that has logging instances. So if you have a compliance person that can come back and say, when is any time anyone's access root in this auditing cycle, they have that whole list, the time, the date, the person, everything. Yep, no problem.
One thing I also wanted to mention, you mentioned two-factor and like SSO and stuff. If your product exposes the web console to the internet, so that doesn't break the single sign-on stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you set it up the way that I showed you how to set it up, it actually breaks any single sign-on. If you let me take a step back. It breaks it if you don't expose your web console to the public internet. So what I didn't show you, in our environment, we have a third internal only EC2 instance. That's our management console. So it has its own URL. That's how we get in and do all of our management. The two Tomcats behind a load balancer are in limited access mode, so they have the console login turned off. If you set it up similar to how we set it up, that will break the SSO feature because it doesn't understand the two URLs, and you get a lot of really weird errors, and it doesn't work. So, do you have a question?
I think we have time for one more.
I have two hopefully quick questions. Number one, have you guys looked at any performance/cost comparisons between having two large EC2 instances versus, for instance, like 8 small ones?
Not in AWS, not yet. If you had been to my JNUC presentation in 2016, I did one on scaling your JSS. But I mean, the simple answer is not yet. These are the types of things that we're going to look at going forward. One of the benefits for me in my environment is in the past, one team 100% owned the database, one team 100% owned ESX, one team 100% owned storage. And so I never had, there wasn't one person that had visibility to any of those things. In this case, I have visibility to all of it now. So it does make it much easier for me as a server manager to be able to try and get that information because I can see all of it and I don't have to ask anybody else for permission to do it. But I haven't done it yet. So.
And I can tell you that you can experiment with different instance sizes and different instance types, and you can start to get that cost-benefit analysis there more tuned in because you will find that our product is more RAM intensive than CPU intensive a lot of the time. So looking at an instance that is RAM centric, that might be beneficial for you. So you can play around with that. You can learn some things on what works best for you.
Okay. Second question is related to S3 and CloudFront. Do you have any tips on estimating pricing for that, or gauging how much data you might end up using in a given month?
S3 is very, very, very cheap. So I'll leave it at that. Like, I think one of our projects right now, we have like 4 tears sitting on top of S3, and it costs all of like maybe $4 a month. It's compressed, but 4 tear for around $4, that's pretty nice.
What about with the CloudFront stuff? Isn't that where the majority of the cost comes from?
I don't know specifically on the CloudFront costs, and that's only going to be showing a cache of maybe a most recent artifact of
Okay.
types. Yeah,
Cool. Thank you.
not a problem.
There is a cost calculator too for that,
Yeah.
that you can use to estimate what those prices are, based on like puts and gets and
Mhm.
whether CloudFront is on and whether
yeah.
you use deep freeze storage and stuff like that.
Yep. Yep. All right.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. If you have any questions or give any feedback, please go ahead and do so. Thank you so
If
much.
you're looking for me, I'll be down at the Cloud and Delivery booth downstairs with my cohorts down there. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to myself.